The townspeople said she had betrayed her blood. They called her wicked, foolish, and worse, unclean, all because she chose love over lineage and truth over tradition. Clara McAllister had always walked the fine line between obedience and defiance, but when she stood beside the Apache warrior under a setting sun and whispered her vows, she crossed a threshold no one in that town would forgive. They didn't wait for explanations. By sunrise, she was cast out, her name scratched from church records, her house boarded from the front like a curse. What they didn't expect was what came next. Clara wasn't a woman of many words, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd stared judgment in the face before and survived it. She didn't cry when they spat her feet, nor when her own cousin turned her away at the gate. Instead, she walked the gravel road back to the old homestead on the edge of the valley, her hand still holding the leather strap that bound her to him. Tocho, son of a chief, brother of warriors, and now, her husband. He said nothing as she approached, but his eyes burned with a vow deeper than any words. She would not face this alone. That night, the plains were not quiet. First came the drums, low, steady, like thunder waiting in the belly of the earth. Then came the light, one flame, then another, 10 torches, held high by 10 tribes, Comanche, Apache, Arapaho, Kiowa, a gathering not seen in generations. They came not to wage war, but to bear witness, to say we saw what she gave up, and we will not let her stand in the dark alone. Warriors, elders, even children stood outside Clara's house, their silence more sacred than song, their torches held like shields against shame. Inside, Clara wept, not because she was afraid, but because she had never felt so seen. She had married for love, but what she received was loyalty. In a world that had torn her roots from the ground, the tribes had planted new ones. That night, something ancient was reborn, not in anger, but in alliance. Not in revenge, but in reverence. The West had seen its share of fire, but never one lit to honor a woman they tried to erase. By dawn, the town awoke to smoke in the distance and silence in the square. No one spoke of Clara aloud, but every man, woman, and preacher knew. She was no longer theirs to banish. She had chosen the fire of truth over the cold of tradition, and 10 nations had answered. And in the Old West, where memory was carried more in story than in stone, that night would never be forgotten. Clara's story didn't begin the day she married Tocho. It started long before, in the quiet hours of her childhood, when she'd sneak down to the edge of the creek to listen to songs that floated across from the Apache camp. While others in her town whispered of savages and superstition, Clara heard stories in the rhythm of the drums, stories of honor, of ancestors, of skies that never lied. Her father, a rigid preacher, warned her of such curiosity, calling it dangerous and disgraceful. But curiosity, once ignited, is like prairie fire. It moves with purpose. It consumes silently. By the time Clara was 17, she had learned to walk with the quiet steps of a scout, to speak with her hands when words would betray her, and to look people in the eyes without flinching. She met Tocho one morning while gathering wildflowers alone. He didn't speak at first, just nodded, and let the moment pass like a breeze. But something unspoken remained. Over the months, their meetings turned to conversations, and conversations turned to something sacred, trust. In a land soaked in suspicion, trust was the rarest currency. Their love was not sudden nor stolen. It was carved slowly, like messages in sandstone. Tocho showed her how to read the wind and track the stars, and she taught him the hymns her mother once sang before sorrow took her voice. They created a language of their own, made of glances and gestures, silences that felt like songs. And still, they knew, this love would not be welcome in either world. The white settlers feared what they did not control. The tribes, too, were wary of those who came from towns built on broken promises and blood-stained treaties. When Tocho asked for her hand, it was not with a ring, but with a feather, white and crimson, bound in leather. She accepted it not as a symbol of marriage, but of war. Not between tribes, nor with guns, but with fear, with judgment, with the heavy gaze of a town that clung to pride more tightly than to grace. And still, she stood with him. They exchanged vows beneath a cottonwood tree, watched by no preacher, but by earth and sky, the only witnesses that mattered. The wind blew soft that day, as if even it dared not interrupt. But when she returned to town with Tocho beside her, silence fell like ash. Doors shut. Faces turned. The mayor refused to look her in the eye. The blacksmith crossed himself. Her father stepped down from the chapel steps, eyes ablaze, not with sorrow, but with rage. He didn't ask questions. He didn't listen. He simply pointed at the church bell, and men gathered. The vote was swift, brutal, and final. Clara was to be expelled, stripped of name, of place, of worth. But that's the mistake they made. They thought worth came from walls and pews. They forgot that some souls are made for the wilderness. The road to her old homestead was lined with memories Clara tried to forget. Her mother's humming, her brother's laughter before the fever took him, and the way her father's hand used to feel soft before it turned to stone. As she walked, the dust clung to her hem like ghosts begging her to turn back. But Tocho walked beside her, and in his silence, she found a steadiness the world had denied her. They did not speak of what had happened. They didn't need to. In the West, some wounds are stitched by silence and fire, not words. When they arrived at the cabin, it was as if the land had been waiting. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and pine. Tocho gathered wood and flint while Clara cleared the dust from the hearth. There was no panic, no fear, just a quiet sense of resolve. By nightfall, the fire roared, and Clara sat in its glow, wondering how many women before her had been broken by the same system, by the same voices dressed as virtue. She refused to be one of them. She would not break. She would burn if she had to, but she would not break. And then came the drums, low at first, like distant thunder rolling over the plains. Then closer, louder, a rhythm older than time, echoing through the valley like a summons. Clara stepped outside, eyes adjusting to the darkness, heart thudding like hooves against dry earth. And then she saw them. One by one, they emerged from the shadows, warriors with painted faces, elders wrapped in furs, children with feathers braided into their hair. 10 tribes, 10 fires, 10 silent declarations of allegiance. No words, no weapons, just presence. Each tribe had its own reasons for coming. Some had known Tocho's father, a chief who once saved their children from a brutal winter. Others came out of defiance, for every treaty broken, for every name erased from history. But all came for Clara, not just for her marriage, but for her courage, for choosing truth in a land that punished it. They stood outside her home, not as an army, but as a shield. And in that moment, Clara realized the fire that burned within her had become a beacon. She wept, not from grief, but from reverence. She had been cast out, but now stood surrounded. She had lost a town, but gained a people. The torches flickered like stars close enough to touch, and the drums carried her heartbeat into the hills. That night, under a sky heavy with ancestors, Clara no longer felt alone. She had walked away from walls built by fear and into a world carved by honor. The town had expelled her, but the West had claimed her, and the West does not forget its own. Word of the gathering spread like wildfire, carried on horseback and whisper alike. The next morning, the town awoke to find their world irreversibly altered. Atop the ridge beyond the chapel, smoke signals danced skyward, symbols only the elders could read, but every man in town felt the message in his bones. Something ancient had awakened. The sheriff, a man once proud of his neutrality, stood frozen at his office door, watching the horizon as if waiting for judgment to descend. Merchants, housewives, even the preacher himself stepped cautiously outside, staring at the faint glow rising from Clara's valley. In the saloon, where gossip bred faster than whiskey poured, the whispers turned uneasy. Had the tribes come to take revenge? Would there be bloodshed? Yet, even in their fear, no one dared ride out. There was something about the silence that terrified them more than war cries ever could. It wasn't rage that filled the air, it was resolve. A unified, righteous stillness that declared, "You do not touch what we protect." And Clara, once dismissed as nothing more than a girl with wild ideas, now stood beyond their reach. Back at the homestead, Clara prepared food in silence while Tocho carved symbols into the doorway, blessings, protections, memories of lineage. The warriors had not asked for hospitality, yet she offered it anyway. She fed the elders first, with hands that trembled not from fear, but from gratitude. Children laughed by the riverbank, chasing dragonflies, while the women wove strands of her hair into ceremonial braids. These weren't gestures of pity. They were rituals of belonging. Clara wasn't being tolerated. She was being claimed. That evening, a chief named Nantan approached her. His eyes were like burnt coals, soft in the center, sharp at the edges. He spoke slowly, as if weighing each word against centuries of silence. "You did not marry into our tribe," he said. "You married into our story." Clara felt her knees weaken, not from the weight of his voice, but from the truth in it. For so long, she had tried to belong to a place that feared truth. Now, she was part of a people who carried it like fire in their chest. The night deepened, and the air thickened with drums and chants. No words were spoken of the town. No curses were hurled across the hills. Instead, songs were sung, songs of resilience, of rising from ash, of women who stood against the tide. In every note, Clara heard echoes of her mother, her childhood dreams, and the sacredness of her own defiance. The world she knew had died at the chapel steps. But what rose in its place was something older, truer, and indestructible. Back in the town, unease settled into the bones of every citizen. The silence from Clara's valley became deafening. The mayor called an emergency council, desperate to understand the meaning of the torches and what they might signal. They argued in circles. Some feared retaliation, others demanded preemptive action. Yet none could offer a single reason why Clara's return had felt like a threat. Only that it had unsettled something in them they weren't ready to face. A mirror, perhaps, to their own hypocrisy. Clara's father, once revered as the moral compass of the community, found his pulpit empty that Sunday. Word had spread that he had exiled his own daughter without trial or scripture. Some called it justice. Others called it shame. He sat alone in the wooden pews, the silence thicker than any sermon he had ever delivered. It was the first time he realized the cost of certainty, how often it demanded the sacrifice of love. And love, once cast out, rarely returned. Meanwhile, Clara stood beneath the stars, watching the torches flicker with purpose. She didn't need revenge. She didn't seek an apology. What she had was something far more dangerous to those who had wronged her: dignity. The tribes had not come to threaten, but to remind. To remind the town that strength does not lie in uniformity, but in truth. That heritage is not just bloodlines, but the choices we make when everyone is watching. One of the elders brought forth a piece of leather, stretched and painted with symbols. It was a declaration, not of war, but of alliance. The 10 tribes, long divided by conflict and grief, had agreed on something rare. Clara and Tocho would be protected, not only by custom, but by blood oath. Should harm come to them, it would be taken as harm to all. In a land governed by rifles and grudges, such unity was unheard of. But love has a strange way of healing fractures pride cannot reach. As the night wind curled through the trees and carried the final embers skyward, Clara sat beside Tocho, her hand resting gently on his. She didn't need to speak. He already knew. In this land of harsh judgments and harder soil, they had planted something impossible, and against all odds, it had taken root. Not in hatred, not in vengeance, but in the stubborn, sacred act of choosing one another and refusing to be silent about it. The 5th morning came with a stillness that felt sacred. Dew clung to the grass like blessings left by the night. Clara opened her door to find offerings left by hands she never saw. Woven baskets of sage, dried corn, a hand-carved flute resting gently on a stone. No name attached, just reverence. These weren't gifts of debt or pity. They were symbols, proof that a woman cast out by her own people could become a bridge between broken nations. In the stories of the West, legends weren't always made by cowboys with pistols. Sometimes, they were born from quiet rebellion. Tocho watched her with the eyes of a man who had always known this would come. "They came for you," he whispered. Clara shook her head. "No," she said. "They came because they saw themselves in me." That difference mattered. The tribes didn't follow leaders blindly. They followed honor. And Clara, by standing firm in the face of abandonment, had become a mirror of that honor. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to something older, something sacred, a living echo of every woman who had ever dared to choose love over fear. Later that day, a rider arrived. Alone. No banner, no weapon, just a dusty hat and a letter in hand. It was from the sheriff. Carefully written, oddly formal. He asked for a meeting, not to accuse, not to condemn, but to listen. Clara read it aloud, her voice calm, her eyes unreadable. "The town is unsettled," the letter said. They expected anger, not dignity. They saw defiance and called it danger. But now they're not so sure. Tocho offered no opinion. This was Clara's decision. And Clara, she folded the letter, lit a match, and watched it burn. Let them wonder. That same night, children from several tribes danced by firelight, laughing, tossing handfuls of cedar into the flames to make them pop and crackle. Clara sat among the elders, her lap full of beadwork and old stories. For the first time in days, she laughed. Not because she forgot the pain, but because it had finally stopped controlling her. Her laughter wasn't just relief, it was reclamation. And that sound echoed the refusal to be erased, the declaration that she would write her own ending, even if she had to carve it into stone. Beyond the tree line, just out of reach, a few townsfolk gathered, watching in secret. Men who once mocked, women who once whispered. They watched her, this woman who had been exiled, and saw something they didn't understand: joy. She wasn't begging to return. She wasn't broken. She was thriving. And that was the real threat. A woman who could survive rejection and still shine? That was dangerous. That was unforgettable. That was power in its purest form. Days passed, and whispers gave way to silence. The town that once held itself high on morality now stood bent under the weight of its own choices. Some tried to justify what had happened, claiming tradition, safety, righteousness, but their voices rang hollow. Even the preacher had stopped preaching. What sermon could justify casting out a daughter for loving too deeply? What scripture could make exile holy? Truth had found them, and it tasted like dust. Back in the valley, life bloomed. The tribes who once kept their distance began planting together, sharing stories, tools, laughter. Clara's home became a gathering place, not for politics or vengeance, but for healing. Wounds older than memory began to mend, not through negotiation, but through presence. There were no speeches, no commands, just people coming together around fire, food, and forgiveness. The West had always been wild, but now it was also wise. Then came the children, dozens, maybe more, who began appearing at her door. Some from the tribes, some from town, seeking stories, shelter, or songs. Clara welcomed them all. She taught them how to braid rope and balance on horseback, how to listen to silence, and how to speak when their voices mattered. She gave them what she never had, a place to belong that didn't require them to become smaller. And slowly, without notice, her home became a sanctuary, not just for the outcast, but for the becoming. One afternoon, an old woman from the town approached. Her gait was slow, her eyes wet with regret. She brought nothing but her hands, empty, trembling, open. "I was wrong," she said. "We all were." Clara did not speak. She simply stepped aside and offered a seat near the fire. That's how healing begins in the West. Not with ceremony, but with quiet space. A place where truth can sit without being chased away. Where stories are shared not to impress, but to understand. By the time the first snowfall dusted the peaks, Clara's name had stopped being spoken with shame. Now it was spoken with awe. Not just by the tribes, not just by wandering cowboys or weathered elders, but by children who didn't yet know what exile meant. They only knew the woman who sang to the stars and welcomed everyone who knocked on her door. The West, they would say one day, was not just tamed by men with rifles. It was reshaped by women who loved harder than they were hated. Winter settled like a hymn across the valley, soft, steady, and full of memory. The snow fell heavy, but not unkind. Clara walked through it wrapped in a thick wool shawl gifted by the Lakota elder, her boots crunching as she checked on each child sleeping in her growing home. Some came for the warmth, others for the songs, and a few, those who had never known a mother's touch, came just to be held. The house that once echoed with solitude now pulsed with breath, with laughter, with stories unfolding in real time. Tocho rarely spoke of the past, but that winter, as the winds howled over the ridge, he finally opened the door to his own wounds. He told Clara about the raids, about the betrayal of treaties, about the time his younger brother never returned. His voice cracked not from pain, but from the burden of holding silence too long. Clara didn't interrupt. She didn't fix. She just listened, like she'd learned from the land. The fire between them popped once, like punctuation, and he nodded. That too was healing. Far away, in the town that had expelled her, things were changing. Slowly, like sap in winter. The schoolteacher, once vocal about Clara's recklessness, now hung her head when her students asked why Clara's name was never spoken. A young man who had jeered during the expulsion quietly left bags of flour and cloth at the edge of the valley trail. No, just penance. Forgiveness wasn't asked for, but somehow it was being built, one act at a time. Then came a snowstorm so fierce, it silenced even the wolves. Roofs buckled. Fires struggled. Townsfolk, unprepared, found themselves desperate. And Clara, exiled, unwanted, forgotten, opened her doors. She sent Tocho with supplies. She handed out blankets she'd sewn by firelight. And not once did she ask for thanks. Because in the West, mercy wasn't weakness, it was defiance. Her kindness became legend, not because it was easy, but because it was offered to those who hadn't earned it. In that storm, lines blurred. Tribe and town, outcast and loyalist. There were no sides, only survivors huddled together. And when spring finally came, melting the frost and softening the ground, it wasn't just flowers that bloomed. It was remembrance that this land had never belonged to fear, to prejudice, or to pride. It belonged to those brave enough to rebuild, to reach across hatred, to stand in the snow for strangers and say, "Come inside." Spring painted the valley in colors the West hadn't seen in years. Wildflowers burst through cracked earth like prophecies fulfilled. Children chased wind, laughter rippling behind them. And Clara, once the woman cast out for loving too boldly, stood in the middle of it all like a mother of nations. Her hair streaked with silver, her hands calloused from labor, her eyes sharp with memory. But her heart, that remained soft, not because life had been gentle, but because she had refused to let it harden her. A group of tribal leaders gathered one evening, unannounced but welcome. They brought with them not weapons, but a circle of drums, a basket of paint, and a robe woven in symbols older than English. They didn't speak much. Instead, they painted her cheeks, placed the robe over her shoulders, and began to sing. Not in honor of what she had done, but in recognition of who she had become. She was no longer just Clara. She was now the one they called Firewalker, the woman who crossed flames and built bridges from ashes. Word of the ceremony spread. Cowboys from distant ranches rode in just to glimpse it. Women from the town stood at the edge of the clearing, clutching shawls and children, unsure if they belonged. Clara saw them. She walked over. She didn't ask them to kneel. She asked them to sit. That was her way. No thrones. No altars. Just dirt, sky, and honesty. The town had thrown her out for who she loved. But now, they were learning how she loved was even more powerful. Tocho sat beside her that night, silent as the stars. He didn't need to speak. His presence said everything. That love could be quiet and still save lives. That a man could lead not with rage, but with respect. He had never tried to change Clara. He had never asked her to bow or break. And because of that, she had grown into something even he had never imagined. They watched the flames together. Warriors, not because they fought, but because they loved through battle. As the drums faded and the fire turned to embers, Clara looked around. At faces once filled with hate, now softened by truth. At hands once closed now, offering bread. At a valley once divided, now united. And in that moment, she realized something. She hadn't just married an Apache. She had married the land, the people, the possibility of what the West could be if courage met compassion. And from that night on, no one ever told her story the same way again. The months that followed carried a quiet reverence, as if the land itself knew it was witnessing a new chapter. Travelers who passed through the valley often stopped at Clara's home, not because they were lost, but because they had heard. They had heard of the woman who was shunned for love, but chose mercy over revenge. Of the house where tribal songs and church hymns mingled in harmony. Of the place where the outcast, the orphan, the stranger, all found room at the table. Clara's name, once whispered in shame, was now spoken in admiration across plains and ridges. The local preacher, once her harshest critic, made the long ride to the valley alone. No congregation, no pulpit, just a man humbled by truth. He asked not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Clara received him without bitterness. She brewed coffee, poured it into a tin cup, and sat with him as the sun dipped behind the buttes. He wept, not for her, but for himself, for the years wasted in judgment, for the opportunities missed, for the way he let doctrine blind him to decency. Clara didn't scold him. She simply placed her hand over his and said, "It's not too late to start again." Children from 10 tribes and 3 towns played together under cottonwood trees. They didn't see color or bloodlines. They saw teammates, companions, brothers and sisters in mischief and mud. Clara and Tocho had built more than a home. They had created a sanctuary, not fenced in by walls, but defined by the absence of fear. Every meal shared, every story told, every song sung across the firelight was another brick in this unseen house of belonging. It was living history, one written not in ink, but in action. Then came the day when riders from every direction filled the horizon, hundreds of them, not for protest, not for war, but to witness a wedding. One of the young girls Clara had raised was to be wed to the son of a rancher who once called Apache savages. The father had asked Clara for permission himself, hat in hand, voice shaking, and she had said yes. That wedding became the symbol of all they'd fought for, not just a union of 2 people, but a declaration that the past would no longer dictate the future. That night, under a starlit sky and the watchful eyes of elders, children, and cowboys, Clara stood beside Tocho, holding his hand. No words were needed. The fire crackled, the drums pulsed like a heartbeat, and in the stillness between notes, the land spoke, of pain healed, of lines erased, of a legacy forged not by bloodlines but by bravery. The same town that had once cast her out now sent their children to learn at her feet. And the fire of 10 tribes still burned bright, not in anger, but in honor. Years passed, but the memory of that night never dimmed. People spoke of it with reverence, like a sacred story passed from one generation to the next. Clara's house became more than a dwelling. It became a pilgrimage. Newlyweds, wayfarers, lost souls, they all came to sit beneath the beam she and Tocho had carved, to warm their hands by the fire where so many wounds had been named and healed. Her name became legend, not because she sought glory, but because she walked with grace when she had every reason not to. Clara grew older, as all do. Her steps slowed, but her spirit never did. She wrote letters in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Apache, so no child would feel unseen. She taught songs to the youngest and history to the oldest, reminding them that peace is not the absence of struggle, but the choice to stand in love even when it costs. And when her hands trembled too much to sew, others picked up the thread. Her legacy was no longer hers alone. It had multiplied, like fire passed from torch to torch. One spring morning, when the sky was especially wide and the air smelled of wild sage, Clara sat on her porch and looked out of the valley. Fields green with promise, horses grazing, children running barefoot. She smiled, not a smile of pride, but of deep, soul-rooted peace. Tocho sat beside her, his fingers tracing the edges of her weathered hands. They didn't speak, because nothing needed to be said. The world they had hoped for was now growing around them. When Clara passed, she didn't die alone. She was surrounded by 10 tribes, 3 towns, and 100 hearts that beat because of her. They lit torches, not in mourning, but in celebration. They didn't bury her with silence, but with song. And on that night, the valley blazed with fire again, not to protest, not to fight, but to remember, to honor the woman who chose love over fear, who married a man and, through that union, married a movement. To this day, when flames rise gently in the western dark and voices sing across the canyon winds, People say she walks with them still, not as a ghost, but as a guide. As the woman who showed that the West could be more than dust and gunpowder. It could be healing, if only we dare to light a torch instead of throw a stone. As the last embers of that story settle into memory, we are left with more than just the image of 10 tribes lighting torches outside a once-forgotten house. We are left with a testament to what happens when love defies tradition, when courage speaks louder than judgment. Clara's journey was not easy. She walked through exile, betrayal, and scorn. Yet through it all, she chose to embrace rather than retaliate, to mend rather than sever. And in doing so, she did not just survive the West, she redefined it. The West was once a place known for its harsh codes and unforgiving rules. But Clara's story teaches us that even in the dustiest towns and the most stubborn hearts, a new legacy can be born. One built not on conquest, but on compassion. Not on bloodlines, but on choice. She showed us that the bravest thing you can do in a divided world is to build a bridge, then stand on it, alone if you must, until others dare to cross with you. In every glance exchanged across former boundaries, in every child raised with the stories of both their ancestors and their neighbors, her spirit lives on. And perhaps that is the true inheritance of the frontier. Not the land, not the cattle, not the guns, but the courage to write a new ending to an old story. An ending that doesn't erase pain, but transforms it. An ending where enemies become kin, and silence gives way to songs sung together around one fire. If her story touched you, it's because something deep inside you recognizes the same battle, the same yearning to be seen, to love freely, to live fully despite the shadows of the past. That fire doesn't only burn in valleys with cottonwoods and tribes. It burns in you. And maybe, just maybe, the next torch to light the world doesn't come from an ancient tribe. Maybe it starts right where you are, in your next choice to listen, to welcome, to love. So if this journey moved you, if Clara's courage stirred something real, don't let that feeling pass unnoticed. Subscribe to the channel to join more stories like this. Like the video if it lit something within you. And leave a comment to tell us, what torch are you ready to carry? Let's build that fire together.